I have brought to you all here today an extensive, my ability, but not actually truly extensive, exploration of Ogham fact and myth. So we're going to explore a little bit about this ancient Irish writing system, and then talk about how it's been misused perhaps by modern scholars as well. So you may notice I have some Ogham actually on these first several screens just to get you seeing it. This is, I didn't print out the pages, dang it. Anyway, so just to get you used to seeing it and not understanding it yet, at least I'm familiar with it. So what is it? Where does it come from? So there's been a lot of scholarship as well as speculation that's been written since the Middle Ages about what Ogham is. And you can see on the right-hand side here, there's lots of weird marks. That's what Ogham looks like. Weird lines, slashes, and diagonal slashes, and double slashes, and it's a writing system. So people have taken all these wild ideas that they had in their head. They started writing things down. They started 3D scanning actual Ogham stones. They began scanning manuscripts that had writing in it. So a lot of information, a lot of original text in Ogham have been able to be brought forward into the 21st century, but it's also allowed a lot of bad information to become widespread. I know we like to blame Victorians for a lot of things, but actually the worst of this came from a fellow in 1948. So a relatively recent misinterpretation of this application. Basics. Ogham is an alphabet that was written to represent the sounds that were present in primitive and then later Old Irish. It consists of these four things. On the left here, A, O, I, and then on the far right, it's called Orfada. But these represent sounds. Every alphabet represents sounds. That's what writing is. Writing is taking our verbal language and being able to record it in a permanent way that is visual, although it can be tactile, right? So this is called the Banwyth Nin, which is the same as ABC, right? A, B, C. That's what our alphabet and the Latin alphabet is considered. These are sounds, A, C. And this is no different. Ogham is represented by the Banwyth Nin. Generally, the order is this. This is the usually recognized order of Ogham letters of writing. It was, as you might have noticed here, written vertically. It wasn't just written sideways like you see today. This is a holdover from the manuscript tradition. I'll get into it in a minute. But originally, these were things that were carved on stones, and they were written vertically from the bottom up, which makes things even more interesting to try to read. They're broken into these four groups of letters. The Acme, the Banwyth Lewis in there, and then here. And then the Forfeda are these letters that were added once primitive Irish began to decline, and Old Irish took over in terms of the spoken language in Ireland and in Scotland at some points. So they needed new letters to represent these new sounds. Some of these old letters were no longer used in Old Irish. This makes reading and writing in this exceptionally difficult, because not only do you have to know Irish, but you have to know Old or Primitive Irish and what those sounds were. And even if you're reading a Latin script that has Old Irish in it, it isn't always clear what is being said because of the ligatures they often use between the different characters. And a lot of the insular scripts, the letters are very compact and seem to be the same shape, unless you've studied it for a while, which is something I have not done enough of. So it's been an interesting journey for me to try to dive into this and the Latin script Old Irish literature to try to have a better understanding. One of the things that you will notice if you have any familiarity with modern Irish is that Old Irish and Primitive Irish before it, they lacked lenition and eclipse. So if I wanted to talk about a plate, a woman, or a girl, I could have plata, plata, van or van, Callan or Colin, right? That's lenition, where you're taking the first letter and adding H sound after it to soften that initial consonant. And then with eclipse, you can see that another letter is eclipsing the first there. So instead of plata, it's plata, on, lean, Callan, Gallen. Old Irish and primitive Irish don't have that. So when you are reading something in Ogham or Ogham, because Ogham doesn't, Ogham represents Old Irish, right? Ogham has an H in it, which is the softening, the lenition. So you will see people debating online about is it Ogham or is it Ogham? In Old Irish, it would be Ogham, O-G-A-M. Ogham is how we say it today in modern Irish. In Old Irish, primitive Irish, all of these things would be written the same way without a lenition, without an eclipse. And these long vowel sounds with a fada accent over them, it would be written exactly the same. So there's no definite distinguishing between long and short vowels in the script. But there was in the spoken language. We can determine that based on how poetry reads, right? You can read a piece of poetry and see where vowels can be longer or shorter. And sometimes with words that have been carried through. So it's written with the same glyph, which makes it interesting. Modern Ogham users have some debate about whether or not you should be using two vowels to represent that long sound or not. Generally, you don't have repeated vowels in modern Irish. You could have a long string of vowels, but it's usually not two A's and two O's or two I's and two E's that are back to back. So you can theoretically represent it that way, but it's a little bit convoluted then if you're trying to translate back. The other thing to point out is that the way sounds, some of the things that we think of as C sound, for example, are represented as Q in the literature. Not always, but often they're represented with a Q. So Mach, the word for sun, is one of the most common words in Ogham inscriptions, monuments, and it's generally transcribed into Latin characters as Mach with a Q, represents a hard sound as opposed to Mach. Hard K. So a little bit about the difference between primitive Old and modern. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the earliest records that we have today in the archaeological record, existing record, are carved stones that look like this side here, and they were written from the bottom left-hand side on the edge of a stone. So you see on some of the ones I had earlier, there's a line that runs through there. It's called a stem line, and these slashes are formed across that edge of the stem. Today, we usually draw a stem line in some of the monuments. The edge was also inscribed with a stem line, but the oldest ones do not have a stem line. This is a great example because it's the edge of the rock, and you can see there's nothing bisecting those. Come on in. It also means that you need to have a good rock. So those of you that are rock hounds here would definitely have a skill that would be valuable in ancient Ireland, because a rounded glacial boulder is not going to do a good job for a writing stone. It needs to have a very sharp edge to things. Ireland, has been inhabited for 9,000 years or whatever, so the people have moved stones around a lot. Some of these inscriptions are on Paleolithic or Neolithic standing stones, which have already been carved down to have these sharp edges, but not all of them. So being able to identify a good stone and hauling it into position, and then carving it is important. And these go around the stone, which is, fun. You go up around the top and then down the side. These are my transliteration with what I can make out on here. This obviously also limits how long your inscription can be because your rock is only so big. If you want to carve letters that are readable from a distance, run into space issues, right? So these oldest surviving things we have today are generally monuments to mark boundaries of land that were controlled by people, or memorials to people, or something. And I talk about this a lot with Ireland, but it's not just Ireland. Ireland is where the majority of these stones are found, as you can see, especially in the southwest of Ireland, but you find it all the way up far northeastern Ireland off the coast of Scotland, down into Cornwall, even in the center of today, you have these stones. So this is a cultural export from Ireland at this time. I haven't mentioned anything about time. We'll come back to it. But while these things were being made, while these stones were being made, they were a way to symbolize, like I said, land ownership. And because there was a lot of power concentrated in Ireland at this time, roughly around 200 or so, for the earliest ones, maybe into like 300. So sort of the fall of the Roman Empire, but before the arrival of the Angles and the Jutes and the Saxons, right? There was a sort of a vacuum here. And the Irish chieftains, lords, were able to have this cultural export. Irish soft power was spreading into these other Celtic-aligned, Celtic-affiliated areas across the Irish Sea. Really interesting. I think there's some more ethnography that could be done on this as well. As I mentioned, it's moderately inconvenient to write on a stone, especially if you want to say something that's more than a sentence long. This is an example that we're going to run through over a couple slides. It's currently built into the side of a church now. It's in Ardmore in County Waterford. Weathering, you can see on the top illustration there, you lose things as the stone weathers. So again, knowing what type of stone to pick for weather well is very important. They also make it difficult to figure out what direction the stone was originally supposed to be read in. Especially if you have a very long inscription that then wraps around on the other side, it can throw things off. And you might also notice that there's not a whole lot of spaces. And start at the bottom left and you go up. Where does one word end? Where does one word begin? If you are fluent in reading Ogham, that becomes a little bit more easy, I suppose, but it's not always. And I'm not at a point of fluency where I can immediately identify word groups. So if we look at the stone again and we translate it out using those letters that we had before, we end up with topic what I was able to decipher out of it. And this is the official Irish monuments, council, board, whatever, monument service. That's what they were able to get out of it. So I'm very pleased with myself that I was able to get most of it out of a photograph and this tracing of things. So you get this long string of letters that, what does it mean? Right? Where does things start? What I can see immediately is again the word knock. So we know that the word sun is in there. Do we have two words in front of this or one? How many words do we have after it? Like I said, I am not that fluent in reading it yet, still working on improving, but those that have been studying this for decades have been able to break it apart into well understood words. So lugodekes mak something, koineta segamonas, dolati bigasegol, which are translating this into the Old Irish of Lugasid, the Lugud, son of someone, descendant of Nad Segamon. And there's several of these Nad Segamon stones in this area, so this may be a powerful ruling family in Ireland at that time. And it's interesting that there's this Gaulish name that's known from a couple of curse tablets, Segamon. And you can tell just by saying the words, they are very similar. Could be cultural continuity from pre-Julius Caesar conquest time up to around 400 here. Same name, obviously not the same name, but cultural ties going back to pre-Roman Gaul. Okay, so how do we solve the issues of use here? Well, writing vertically, like we said, is not great. Around 800, Ogham began to be used in manuscripts. So not just stones. Now we have the technology of pens and parchment. We're able to document these things. They may have originally tried to continue this vertical writing scheme, but I know of no examples of that in the manuscript tradition. Every example I know of that I've seen, that I've dived into, is horizontal, left to right, like this. General, like this. And again, it's not always the easiest to decipher, but now you're in the realm of normal problems with manuscripts as opposed to also trying to decipher, monumental carvings. And there's, for an example up on the top, right, we've got an insular script that is not terribly easy to decipher in Old Irish. And what is very helpful is that they started adding these feather marks that indicate the beginning and the end of sentences. And in some cases, you even get spaces, which is just the drawn stem line, but not necessarily any sort of slashes for the character. So now we can begin segmenting sentences out easily in some cases, which is great. About 80% of all the surviving Ogham inscriptions in the manuscript tradition come from this Book of Ballymote, which I've got photos of here from the Royal Irish Academy. It's a pretty cool volume in general. The first page is like a neat little drawing of Noah, his family fleeing the flood, coming to Ireland. It's a very fun illustration. But it has this section that's called the Scholar's Primer. Oriceps over there, which is part of that. This is basically how we know what Ogham was and how it was taught during the Middle Ages. Because this is the Scholar's Primer. If you were in Ireland trying to learn how to read and write in Ogham, you would be taught off of something very much like this, whether it's this book or some other one across the island. And we give a bunch of weird things. It's really cool. This is another page from this, and you can see all of that there is Ogham. And there's a bunch of, I don't want to say bizarre, but unusual and otherwise previously unattested forms of Ogham that are written out here, including these circular forms, square form. There's one where they're serpentine ups and downs and divings. Elder Futhark is actually in here as Viking room, as Viking Ogham, which is kind of interesting. Especially considering around this time we had into these Gaelic-controlled areas. Not necessarily for this one into Ireland at this point, but over across into Scotland. Definitely had Norse raiding. So you had this cultural transmission occurring across the Irish Sea. It's reflected in this manuscript. So, where did it come from? This is really where a lot of the debate comes from. There's two things. Where does it come from and how did they use it? Some people have interesting ideas, some people have other interesting ideas, but not all of them are as well grounded. So the first idea is that it was divinely created by Ogham, which is a Gaulish god. Lucian describes him as the Gallic Hercules. And he's represented by this old man with rings and silver chains, rings through his tongue, and these silver chains attached to men, leading them across the plains by his eloquent speech. So maybe it's this pre-Roman form of communication divinely created by Ogham. Ogma, or Oma, depending on who you talk to today, is an Irish god or member of the Tuatha Dé Danann, depending on your take on those. Could even be a folk hero. But the Tuatha Dé Danann are a group of very powerful individuals or gods or demigods that are present through a lot of Irish mythology and folklore. They are present for the a lot of these foundational acts of the Irish fighting off invaders, eventually being defeated by invaders and turning to the other world. And in mythological sources, Ogma is credited with the invention of Ogham. And it's said that he was in Gaulish Primer, where he's credited with this as well, to set the nobles apart from the rustics. So, clearly there's maybe perhaps a little bit of scholarly influence on that with the dissemination of literacy, right? But, Ogma, people say that this may be a descendant tradition from Ogmios. Obviously, the names sound very similar, right? There's also some interesting bits about Ogma's folklore, Shining One, which maybe is related to the silver tongue and the silver chains. So there may be some connections there. It's not fully agreed upon. But in traditional Irish mythology and literature, this is the guy who did it. Basically. One of the other things that's been suggested is Gaulish hand signs from the Druids. Like flashing letters like this, pretty easy to flash up fingers, flashing gang signs through the trees. When Caesar's talking about the Druids in Gaul, he talks about how they don't write down their sacred knowledge for teaching. But we do know that, at least mundanely, Gauls were more than happy to write things down. They tended to write in either Greek characters or they wrote in Latin. So this is from France. This is the Gaulish inscription to the mother goddess of Planum. This person gave a tithe in gratitude. So it's not like divine teaching, where Caesar says there would be a proscription against it, but it is like a religious inscription. There was a tithing to this. There's other things in Greek characters that are Gaulish that talk about curses and things like this that are semi-religious in nature. So hold that in your mind. Caesar says they didn't write down. So, some folks have suggested that Ogham or Ogham, in writing some of the Ogmios mythology with the silver chain, writing here, it's a way to resist Roman power. Remember, I said this is filling this power vacuum as the Roman Empire is in decline. So maybe there is a correlation here, right? Non-Latinized script, you look at it and you see lines, it's not necessarily easy to interpret. And it was later exapted into become this memorialization boundary marker tradition. People have said maybe it's this Christian resistance, a non-Latin script to resist the power of the Catholic Church coming in like 398 or so. So again, timing is very close. Other people have said it's a Christian language because Old Irish has a lot of sounds that aren't found in Latin. And so Latin characters don't always do it justice. So a new alphabet could help solve that issue. So really, you could say, okay, it's God's, or it could be basically anything. It's to resist or help the spread of various. So Gaulish hand signs, I don't think this is going to work very well because this is very hard to see through a forest in Gaul, right? We have languages, orthography that was well adapted to use across the Celtic world at that time, inventing a new alphabet, a new script to do something that is already known seems kind of odd. And there's a big distance between when Gaul itself was conquered by Caesar and our first known Roman inscriptions exist. That's a big gap in time. Seems like a problem. I think that the idea of this being a resistance language is not very well supported either. There are bilingual Latin Ogham inscriptions, so there were clearly people that knew both languages. It's spreading across the seas at this time. And if you're putting up a big stone that has these letters on it, eventually someone's gonna be like, oh yeah, that's Bob's stone. That's the son of Jim or whatever, right? These ideas of resistance sort of fall apart if you think about the fact that there are bilingual. Ogham as a Christian language also doesn't really make sense because there's fewer characters encoded in Ogham than there are in the Latin orthography. So why make a new alphabet that does your job worse? Maybe it's to try to preserve the sounds. And some of the sounds that are encoded within Ogham are only present in primitive Irish, which predates the Christianization of Irish. So it can't really be a Christian language. Our first account of Christians is 398. Let's say when they landed there a couple decades earlier. You still have stuff that is in a language that was 100 years before they're all. So it doesn't make sense as a Christian. It unfortunately doesn't give us a whole lot of solid origin, right? Referenced in these mythological stories encodes things that are not spoken. We know it's pretty old, older than Christianity. It probably doesn't go back to the beginning of Gaulish independent movements, right? All we can say about it really is that it's a pre-Christian alphabet that is indigenous to Ireland. That's where you see the greatest number and also the oldest ones. Sometimes before about 350 CE. And it's spread as an expression of soft power. The rest of the Western European So we've talked about the monuments. You've seen some monuments, very cool. Let's talk about the myth part that we've all been reading. We've gone through a lot of like the hard facts. So we know from mythology, oral history. I don't want to like try to mix everything here, but we know oral histories were written down during the Middle Ages, and so these stories have deep roots. How deep they are, if they're 50 years or 150 years or 350 years, we don't understand. But we know that they predate the time that they were written. Right? And in some of these medieval sources, like Tokmar Catane, there's a druid, Dalin, who uses Ogham. There's a story about a druid writing down Ogham on these staves and using that for divination of some sort. And it's not known. It's just one of those things that might have been common knowledge in 1300 when the story was written down. Lost sense how those things were used. Just like the idea of like inserting a floppy disk. People would know how to do that in 1997 pretty easily. If you ask someone to insert a floppy disk in a class here, you're an insane person. So things that are commonplace aren't often described, and you lose what that commonplace meaning is. We don't know what this actually looked like. And then in 1948, this dude, Robert Graves, came up with his tree alphabet. And some of this is based on what was in the Scholars Primer, but it was a terrible misunderstanding of what the Scholars Primer was trying to do. You can see the same circular figure here we saw in the original manuscript, been reproduced in this tree. As an aside, these are actual Druid divination tools. Like, these are pre-Christian Druid divination tools from, both of these are from, what is that, Britain. There's a whole series in the British Museum of divination spoons that are made of copper or bronze. I don't know exactly how they were used. Fascinating. I'd love to figure out how to make a replica of something. And this is the Colchester surgeon grave. And some of these tools are likely very similar to what was used by Roman surgeons. Some of them are direct replicas of Roman surgeons, and then some of them are slightly different. But found buried with his board game and a few other things. These are undoubtedly from people that would have been considered Druids at the time. These are not Ogham. There's no Ogham anywhere on any of these. And they are both not only pre-Christian, but pre-Roman. We can tell, or right around the time of Caesar's arrival in Britain, we can tell that these are not going to be garbled transmission from that time. But influenced by Rome, perhaps. So the tree alphabet, like I said, comes from a misunderstanding of this book and what Ogham is. So this section of the Scholars Primer called En Lever Ogham, which is Old Irish for the Book of Ogham. And presents in that list there, all of those things that I was showing you earlier are essentially Ogham's that function like a children's book. Like if you go to a store today and you buy a book for a 3-year-old, and it's got a bunch of different construction tools, right? H is for hammer, N is for nail, D is for drill. 1,000 years from now, yes, the constructioner's alphabet. You must chant about the drill as you build the wall. So each one of these things, and there's 100 plus of them, here's a few of them. They're all associated with things that people are familiar with to help them become familiar with the letters. Just like a children's book today associates common items with these letters and the sounds they are making. Cat, all these things. So there's a bird one. Each one of those letters has a bird associated with it. Colors, agricultural things that are happening, fields and crops and stuff like that. Water, so different ways that water is flowing, different breeds of dog, milk cows and steers, all sorts of stuff. Some of these are related to like doing hand signs, like the nose and the palm and the foot. Those are like flashing your fingers against sin, or across your nose, or patting your hands in a kind of undefined way to symbolize those things. So there's a little bit of, maybe other use besides just teaching sounds, but the vast majority of these are ABC. Some of these have been adapted especially into New Age books that are disconnected from the source material. Like the Theon's Ladder is a classic. The divinatory one here that I have marked. This is the only documented way that Ogham has been used in a divinatory manner, and it was to determine the gender of a child. So if a woman is pregnant, they can read through this and use the letters to figure out if it was going to be a boy or a girl. I don't know if they had other Ogham. So if you look at this stuff, there's a wide variety of things that can be tossed out. There's our circular Ogham. We have there's cards, staves, things like this. But pretty much none of these things that you see here are associated with any of the documented mythological uses or sources, or with the stuff that's found in Lepo or Ogham. The Celtic Wheel of the Year is also not a thing. A lot of people try to smash everything that is non-Christian and European into this one neo-pagan sort of zeitgeist, and it's just not a thing. Pre-Christian Celts absolutely had a calendar. That's not a wheel. This is the Caligny calendar, and it documents all the months and festivals. It's really, really cool. I can do something else on that at some point, but it is not a Celtic Wheel of the Year. So, all of these things that come up are not what was used in the historic sources, or if they are, we don't know if staves are actually related to these. This is not me trying to poo-poo on anyone's spiritual practice either. I'm a Celtic reconstruction paganist. This is very interesting to me because this is my practice. But just be aware, some of this stuff is stuff that people have taken from the sources. And some of this stuff is maybe less related to those original sources. If you are interested in this sort of stuff, staves seem to be the best way forward because it is documented. Okay. And this is just one of the ones that just really got me when I was putting this together. These interpretations come from where? This is the same letter, moon, right? And reaping what we've sown, goals that come into fruition, or it's contradiction. Who comes up with these? There's not a source that these folks can trace these back to. And if you want to say that's hey, this is my idea, is how I interpret this. I mean, great, that's awesome. But the original Irish sources don't say that, and that's what it's cool. Sometimes it does feel a little bit appropriate, but I think that comes from when people are using it without recognizing the limitations. This is what has been done. Here's how we are interpreting it. So I was going to have you all practice it. In fact, I still do that. I'm going to go get some paper very quickly. And I would like you to practice writing out these 3 sentences, which are hello, and your name, and how are you? Those 3 are. I'll be right back.
We said there'd be a test.
When Rob gets back, I have a question about the timeline. It's triggered another thought, and I think I missed the earliest attested use of the Ogham that we have. So if he hasn't run away yet, I have a question, and if he has, I'll wait till he gets back.
Here he is. I'm only partially back. I brought in an Ogham stone that we 3D printed. You can kind of see on the edges. Just barely came off the printer, so I haven't had a chance to detail it up to make it easy. I
was gonna say this is much larger than this. Oh, you know, that was gonna what? I don't know. Oh, okay.
Don't either.
Yeah. Oh, really? So you should make that before I got there. Could you stay till 7? Sure.
It is difficult. Oh, she can't even hear me because he has a lapel on. But
You are welcome. You got it.
Any of that second folks?
Yeah, you can do that.
Anne had a question for you.
Take it away, Anne.
Okay, so this might be a conversation you and I need to have in person, but so this is the thought that triggered. So you're talking about the sort of the transition away from the usage of Ogham. And what it made me think of is I'd say probably like the 500s or 600s in England, they had switched away from using the runic alphabet and they had transitioned with the age, with the kind of intrusion of Christianity. They started using the Roman alphabet. So what I was curious about is if the latest attested, I can't talk, the latest attested use of Ogham coincides with about the same time that Christianity kind of took over in Ireland, because I'm wondering if there's something to be said for the loss of these cultural alphabets, when they were Christianized, and seeing if that had something to do with the adoption of Latin, especially like with Church Latin.
It's interesting. I think it'll be a good conversation now. I don't think that there's a correlation because some of these Ogham manuscripts are being produced in the 13 and 1400s.
Got you.
In the manuscript tradition, but there's also the suggestion that it was almost lost around 8 or so, and then brought back into the manuscript tradition.
Interesting.
Also, yeah, that'd be fun to try to figure out if that's potentially related.
It is really curious, especially because like with the whole linguistic area of the British Isles and Ireland is actually kind of complicated and rather interesting, because one of the things that we know is that there's very little Celtic influence in modern English. And so when you're looking back at it, there's a specific use in Old Irish and in Old Scottish, I think, about the verb to do. There's a couple usages of to do that only exist in Celtic that we adopted into modern English. And what's really interesting about that is they think it has to do with like when the Anglo-Saxons, right, when they had kind of come in and all those guys are doing the war thing that they do, they shoved the Celts out of Eastern England and they moved them westward. And so at a
Mhm.
certain point, they had, they basically kicked him out of Britain. And so they took the Celtic languages with them. And so I just think it's very, very interesting because there's no, as far as I know, there's no Ogham found in England. Like, I don't think we have anything. I think the earliest scripts we have in England and Wales are runic alphabets. So it makes me really curious as to when Ogham was actually adopted versus like when they were booted out of Ireland. So just kind of like random linguistic-y thoughts
Yeah.
that I don't have an answer for you. I just wondered if there's some like kind of coinky-dink. So you and I might have to nerd out about this next time I see you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we'll have to do because looking at that map of Ogham stone distributions, I was also struck by the fact that it's like, okay, all like the Anglo-Saxon core area is nearly devoid of these stones, like, and only like, yeah, like you said, there's basically none there. There's two, and they've both been discovered, I think, in this century. So it's super interesting that you get that retraction away from that area, like you're talking about. Yeah. Let's nerd out about that some more.
You got it. I have an article for you. Remind me to send it to you if I forget. It is an article from, I want to say like, it might be the 80s. I'm not sure. So it's old-ish, but it's linguistics. So, it's effectively timeless. But it's specifically about that do verb I was telling you about. And it
Mhm.
might be of interest to you, especially as we're kind of looking at this sort of in the timeline of where these things are lapping and overlapping and all that. So I'll remind me to send that to you because I think you might find it interesting.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yes, if I don't get it from you soon, I will poke you about it.
Yes, please do. Okay, I want you to know, Rob, this was so freaking cool. And I want more classes on this shit. I'm so glad you touched on the new age stuff because I was going to get your perspective on that because Robert Graves, he is a poet, and I have a lot of thoughts about Robert Graves. And so you and I are going to have to talk about that because I know that you're a Celtic Reconstructionist and I am a Greco-Roman Reconstructionist. So I'm with you on the historical accuracy. But I would love if you could do a class on pronouncing Irish,
Oh.
both old, yeah, like, because I can't pronounce it for shit. And so I would love for you to like do a follow-up to this and teach us a little bit of like the pronunciations and stuff of
I will
old or modern,
happily
whatever
do-
you're more comfortable with.
I'll happily do that after I get back from Ireland because I have no
That's so
guarantee.
awesome. Okay, I'm so excited. You can't see me, but I'm grinning like a lunatic up here. Like this is so cool. So thank you for this.
Yeah. Are you also doing the practice here? There's been a request to be able to show your work when we all see you next as well.
I have not been because I am also frying hamburgers at the same time that I am listening to you and I'm pacing and like grinning like an idiot. So send me your if you can send me on Facebook like a screenshot or something of the sentence you want us to practice, I will totally practice that and I will show you guys on Tuesday.
I just made an observation.
Yes.
This is really good and silly, but so working from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
There it is, the left to right.
Mm-hmm.
Bada bing.
Bada bing, bada boom.
It's that straightforward.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It was a lifesaver when I was trying to like get down some of this, and I'm not great at it, but I'm.
Oh, that's cool.
Do we have any extant finds of Ogham writing on anything other than stones?
So we've got stones, we've got the manuscript tradition.
Well, I mean, like 400 and earlier.
No,
Nothing but stones.
nothing but stones, which is interesting. There's a very super minor caveat to that. How's everyone feeling about their practice? We need a little bit more on this.
Why did you pick eyes? So many eyes.
So many lines.
So many.
Yeah, there's some speculation that this was a language or a writing system that was used on perishable materials like leather, cloth, with embroidery or whatnot, and wood. So we do have that tradition of it being used
Right.
on wood staves, but there's no archaeological evidence for that.
I mean, but you'd think that they would find one, two. I mean,
Or like on metal, you would imagine.
On
Because
metal,
we
yeah.
do have a tradition of metal stamping, metal carving, these earth tablets.
right. Right, that was a huge thing for Romans.
Yeah.
And I know that they found tons of just casual writing things in various Futharks all up in Scandinavia.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, you get all the graffiti up in like the headlines, whatever. Yeah.
you'd still find. I mean, unless all they wrote on was.
Yeah.
But I mean, would you want practice
Right.
stuff?
Yeah, you're like, oh, can't mess up the Chiefs like memorial stuff. Better get this right the first time.
Sticks and dirt.
Yeah, sticks of dirt, wax tablets were certainly
Wax tablets,
a
maybe.
technology that would have made it across. Because we know that even though the Romans weren't like established as a presence on the island of Ireland, there was certainly trade happening back and forth with all sorts of Roman trade goods. So they would have been exposed to these sort of technologies. And anything that Romans had in Britain in the year like 150, you would expect to find over across the Irish Sea. So it would be very odd if they did not have some. So the future, who can say what the future holds? But hopefully we do find more stuff that can answer some of these questions. We're always looking for stuff. Digitization, there was a whole Ogham 3D resource on there. I can link to that, but I'll share with you all here in a minute. Where a whole bunch of these stones have been digitized, print them out, download them. A lot of translation has been done. Not everything has been uploaded and fully documented, but many have. Obviously, continuing to make new manuscripts digitized. It's going to be great for having more of a corpus. There's been an idea of modernizing Ogham for use in a variety of things, but basically in modern Irish to help represent the sounds that exist now. Fill that out. This is one example. I don't really like it for a lot of reasons. Using it that way, but it may or may not be. We've got an app that you can have, which is great. I've got it on my phone. You can type in Ogham on your phone. I think it's like a $2 app. They also have a bunch of Art alphabets as well on there. You can have for your keyboard. That's a fun thing. So, my conclusions here. So, modern neo-pagan uses of Ogham tend to dominate the online space. If you search for just Ogham online, you're going to get a lot of neo-pagan resources. Some of them are better than others in terms of like they're pulling from the historical record. There's a place called the Ogham Academy in Ireland where this gal, Laura O'Brien, she runs a YouTube channel as well. She did her master's on Ogham inscriptions in Waterford and Wexford, and also is a Celtic reconstructionist. So she's got a lot of like this cross-pollination, looking at like where the hard record ends and where the spiritual aspect for her begins. So that's kind of nice to see that there's people looking at that in that aspect, but still there's going to be a lot of other stuff out there. And it represents this pre-Christian form of writing in Irish, and Pictish, which is sort of an interesting sort of sidebar thing as well with the Picts in general, right? And possibly other mundane but perishable items outside of the stone. And then there's just some really cool resources here. I highly recommend all of these. So ogham.co is an online translator. You type in whatever you want, and it'll give you the Ogham, whether that's in vertical or horizontal form. If you try to type in something that is not represented in one of the characters, it will tell you that and admit it. It won't just like try to make something up in there. So you can type in modern English and get something and really miss a bunch of letters, but you can do it. And it's pretty random. Sketchpad has the Ogham in 3D project. That's where that stone came from. Ireland printed it off of there. And then this other site here, the Ogham database that the Monuments Department runs in Ireland has a list of most of the Ogham monuments and stones across the island, geolocated with photographs, transliterations, transcriptions, translations, any citations that have been done on them. A lot of these were first published on the first half of the 20th century. So there's not a whole lot of new stuff, but it does seem like there's a little bit of revitalization. New publications that are trickling out. And then, what was that slide? As a last word, there's this interesting, I don't have another way to put it, interesting thing. It turned up in 2015 at the site of Star Car in England, which you may know for the amazing and haunting red deer antler frontlets, the eye holes and all that. It's an incised stone that has these hash marks on it. Are they related? We don't know. First blush would probably be no, especially since these are Mesolithic. So this would push back any sort of writing in Europe thousands of years. But it is interesting that there's this hash mark line tradition present in the Isles and Mesolithic. So interesting folks over there. Thanks. Yeah.
Have they found any stones outside of the islands?
None that I'm aware of. So like not even in Brittany or anything like that where you get Celtic languages. There's none there. There's no evidence of Ogham stones in Iceland where you would have Irish prisoners taken up there. Well documented. So it seems like it was a very restricted technology, whether that's like intentionally restricted, not for the general populace, right? Or whether it's because it was just never commonly used outside of this strip of land. Folks in power were, which who's to say on some of that. You would expect to see some overlap between folks that are being taken on raids out to Iceland and folks that are exposed to Ogham based on where these like Waterford and Wexford, those are both Norse originated names, and there's a lot of Ogham stones there. And the timeline matches up, but we don't. You get them in Cornwall, you don't get them in Brittany. Kind of interesting.
You don't see them taken as plunder and booty.
No. But yeah, a lot of interesting questions that can still be asked and maybe answered. Future work on the subject. Got something else?
I do, but I'm not sure how to make it into a functional question.
Maybe I missed it, but how big on average were they like monumental?
Yeah,
Like,
heights,
so like this guy is not
no,
like it's not
that is not.
okay. Because I'm like where you initially described it as like or at least early documentation as place markers and
Yeah, these are
that
I think Neolithic standing stones that someone carved on the corner of them. So
yeah,
human size plus.
and that would be why they do.
I don't know.
We got an obelisk in New York City.
Obelisks in British museums, so
Yeah.
Obelisk in Rome.
well, I was gonna say the Romans, they took all that stuff.
Yeah. For whatever reason, these are not desirable objects, apparently.
Maybe they weren't recognized as being anything outside of that culture.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For rockhounds among us, the database also lists what type of stone the monument was made of.
was there a stone?
Not that I saw. I didn't peruse every attestation on there, but it seemed like it was what was local. Local. It wasn't like a Stonehenge type situation. It doesn't.
That really kind of speaks to the idea that they didn't have anything to do. Because you didn't really start the sun, which was
Yeah. True. Celtic spirituality is very localized. Yeah. Any special interests.
We're not gonna be talking about.
Mhm. That would be something I would be interested in, a class on runes, origins. Might be a similar series.
Yeah, my understanding is that Elder Plutarch is, it's mostly, descended from Black Creekers.
Hmm.
And Elder Plutarch has always been like that. But. Nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
Goodbye, Anne. Bye.
Oh, shit.
Bye, nerds.
Ball.